December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy.
You remember December 7th, 1941? Do you remember Pearl Harbor?
I'm trying to think. We were living then in Pennock, Minnesota, in this little town, the church. I was 4, then 5. Not really. I don't really have a real vivid memory of it, to tell you the truth. I have more later years when my dad was overseas that we had a Philco radio and we would sit and listen to the news of the war on the Philco radio, but I don't remember distinctly.
So, 1941, obviously the United States gets caught up in the war, and you're 5 years old at that time. Do you remember your dad was he drafted?
No, he had volunteered.
He volunteered?
He had gotten a memo from the church headquarters that they were looking for chaplains, that the military was asking them for chaplains. And so I think he felt, I think there were several things I think that entered his mind. He decided he was very patriotic. He was a very kind of laid-back man. He was a very kind gentleman, and but he, I think, felt very much patriotic and was really decided, could he leave his family? Could he do this, you know? But he also had this adventure spirit, which is why I traveled halfway around the world and then lived in, and actually, the last year of his service, we lived in Clearfield, Utah. That's another story, too. But
So he was given the church, the Lutheran church, reached out. Was it a certain synod that he was a part
right,
of?
the Augustana Synod, the Swedish Synod.
Okay.
That was the old Augustana Synod.
So he was part of the Augustana Synod, and there was just probably a circular letter that said, looking for chaplains, and he raised his hand.
Exactly. That's exactly what happened.
And as such, what time period would this have been?
He actually enlisted in December of 1942.
Okay.
He left he actually left in January of 43 to go to Norfolk for the chaplain's school.
Mm-hmm.
And so he went to chaplain's school, and he said there they were taught how to wear a uniform, how to salute, survival at sea, and the rights and privileges of an enlisted man. And then he had a 10-day leave. So when he left, I was 6, my brother was 4, and my mother was 4 months pregnant. So he came home then for 10 days, and he actually, on March 15th of 43, he left on the train to go to San Diego, California, to Camp Elliott, where he was there for, I think, 1 or 2 months. So here again, this is what they did to train, get the unit together, and and he also tells us what he was trained there for too, because that's where they got their supplies, how to, uniforms and foot lockers and all of this. I'm always amazed as I read some of this that he wrote, is that I can't even imagine the organization that it took to put together a unit and then a division and to have these men fed, housed, uniformed. And it was very rigid. I mean, when he was packing to go overseas, what they had to do was just amazing. Getting you ready for your role and what was expected of you. And also how to be an officer, really, I think.
Yeah.
Because they start as a lieutenant,
Right.
a JG or whatever it's called. Yeah.
Lieutenant JG.
Junior grade, I guess that is.
And so then he's out in San Diego, and the next stop for him is?
So then on April of 1943, he sails on the SS Lurline, which is a destroyer ship out of California. And he said it was a SS Lurline was a destroyer escort out of the bay they were escorted out of the bay to avoid enemy submarines. There were 4,000 Marines on board, plus supplies and equipment. They were 28 days at sea. He notes that the food was good and that they had a civilian crew, which I found quite interesting, and I don't know. At that point in time, they were headed for Auckland, New Zealand. Now, on the way, I have written down every place that they stopped on or the islands that they stopped, like New Caledonia, Melbourne, and Wellington, New Zealand. This is all the ship on the way to Auckland. And I've also written what those cities are all about, but that's for later. So he gets to Auckland, and then he said that it was very, how does he say? It was foggy, rainy, muddy. There's a picture of him standing in the mud in New Zealand. But he said the people were fine. People were kind and generous, and that he said some of the guys some of them married Australian girls. But so from Auckland, then they're there, and they are there for about 2 months. He called those tourist days because he was roaming around Auckland and making other visits. He'd always look up old ministers. I mean, he just. So then in July 43, they sailed on the City of Newport News for Guadalcanal. And the landing crafts functioned so well, he said, that he got ashore without getting wet.
Yeah.
So when he got there in July of 43, the island had really been, the Japs had actually officially left the island. And the reason they were there, these were Seabees and engineers. And he said that, despite that the Japs had gone, that they still had air alerts and that they had some bombings from the other ships on the side. So, and the first day he was there, he did live in a foxhole. And even though they had shelling from the other ships, so he lived in a foxhole, and then gradually they gained control of the island and food got better. They sent up tent cities with streets, generators, telephones. He had his church services in the mess hall, and when he had communion, he would fill out communion cards and write to families telling them of the church attendance of their son. Incidentally, he does, speaking of men, in one letter he writes that he's glad that the Navy and he ended up going overseas with the Marines, didn't allow women overseas. He said the Army did allow their female nurses overseas, but he said he was glad that he didn't have to deal with any women in the base. So, yes, I forgot to mention that he actually enlisted in the Navy, and all of a sudden he gets orders to join that he's going overseas with the Marines, because the Marines took their doctors and their ministers from the Navy. Yeah. So that was a surprise to go over with the Marines, because he bought all these Navy uniforms, then he had to buy Marine uniforms. And he complained that some of this stuff you had to pay for yourself, and he couldn't. So he is now on Guadalcanal, and he said they were there for 4 months, and more or less just building up the island and roads. And he said he felt safe once they got inland, and they had tent cities, and actually he'd even have movie nights for the gentlemen. So this was kind of a working group. Well, then in November of that year, he sailed to Bougainville, and when he went to Bougainville, and they were, first, and the first duty on this island was to build an airstrip. And their D-Day 8-hour landing took place right on the 1st of November. And they were on a thin strip of sand and jungle, and an airstrip was constructed with the help of the 19th Regiment and the 25th CB Battalion. The project was completed and presented to General MacArthur on Christmas Day, 1943, as a present. Then the Army took over. And so then he was on that island only 5 to 6 weeks, really just to build this airstrip. And then the army came in. And so they left on Christmas Eve. And so this is the one where I have a article from an AP newspaper, from the newspaper. That is probably one of the most significant articles that I have. I do have other articles from the paper from him, but this is probably the most interesting one, and I'll see if I can read it, because every time I do, if you don't mind, if I read it.
Please, please.
The Marines of Cape Torquino and these other lagoons and the forks of the Paiva River has said goodbye today to the fellows who won't be going back. The farewell came just a few hours before they, the living, went aboard transports to sail away from Bougainville. Their job was done. They said their farewell simply at a brief memorial ceremony in a tiny jungle graveyard. They stood silently outside the whitewashed rails that enclosed the row on row of white crosses and heard Lieutenant Bertil A. Erling of Pennock, Minnesota, Protestant chaplain, read the prayer for the dead. They may rest in their labors. They have fought a good fight. As he spoke, the warm tropical wind ruffled silently the leaves of the palm trees that shade the graves. In the distance, artillery spoke fitfully. A firing squad fired 3 volleys. A bugler sounded sound taps. From the jungle came another echoing bugle. That was all. Then the living in battle dress, tired and solemn, filed slowly by the crosses. They will be remembered. Then, after Bougainville, in December of 43, they returned to Guadalcanal. And this was, it said the services were held aboard ship with a fine Christmas dinner. Dad says the sailors eat better than the foxhole dwellers who live on Spam and dehydrated potatoes. The 3rd Marine Division was like getting home on their return to Guadalcanal. Dad reports good food, movies, 4 Sunday services, baseball games, and tent living. They rested here until May of 1944. The stay was approximately 4 to 5 months. While there, they trained for an attack on Rabaul. I'm not going to be able to pronounce all these islands' names, but they were standing on board in line to board the ship when General MacArthur called off the operation, which Rabaul was really a very, very entrenched, the Japs were very entrenched there with all the tunnels and all that, and he was glad that they didn't have to stay there. Then he set sail on May of 44 on the USS Grant, a presidential liner. There were 20,000 men on board. They spent 52 days on board en route to Guam. And there they stopped at different islands too, and I could write that. But these islands were simply stopping off places that they were on the way when they were at sea. So he landed on Guam in July of 44. De-landing H hour 8 a.m. He boarded a landing boat at noon. The shelling on the beach was so severe that they churned at sea for about 4 hours. This part of Dad's military service represents the most dangerous of his adventures. It was here that he was assigned a guide and a guardian. He was a chaplain's assistant who was armed. My dad chose not to be armed, by the way. On the final landing, his guide went ahead of Dad and helped him as they struggled to get ashore. Mortar shells were falling around them, hitting some men. The first order on the beach was to bury 21 bodies and assist at the first aid station. They dug a foxhole and spent the night on the beach less than 10 feet inland. That was on a Friday, and by Sunday, they were able to have a breakfast because when you boarded the ship, you'd have 2 meals on a box on your belt, and it's at least 2 quarts of water, and I found that interesting before they would go out to sea, or before they were going to do a landing. So they were and it was from there that he then was taken home in July. So this was, in September. So he said on Guam, once the island was secured, he says that that the 88th Army Division, Ernie Pyle's division, came in to relieve the Marines who went on inland and then started building roads. And his so they established a small village and had a small church which was cleaned up and made ready for services. By this time, the island was secured, and Dad had Bible classes. This was the first time land was recovered that had belonged to the United States, and that was Guam. Then came, he said, equipment construction, airstrips were built for B-29s. And in September, one day, in September of 44, had a service one day, and that afternoon they came and told him he was being relieved and put him on a plane. He had just a backpack, and later he did retrieve some of his things. But anyway, my dad had never been in an airplane. And so I have his return flight. I have all the details of the first stops and the landings and St. Elmo's fire on the Plain of the Wings. I mean, his trip and each island where they stopped, and I can mention some of them because some of them are quite interesting. They stopped in Saipan, and then they stopped in Eniwetok, Enwetok. Then another one, I can't pronounce it. Then Johnstown Island. Now, Johnstown Island is really interesting. It's only 1,000 yards long and 20 yards wide, and nothing but sand and coral. I made a note, how do they ever find these places? Interestingly, in the 50s and 60s, it was used for nuclear testing, and then later an incinerator plant was built and chemical weapons were destroyed, along with 400,000 rockets, bombs, mortars, and so. In 2004, it was totally evacuated and torn down, and is considered a plutonium minefield. All that is left is a wildlife preserve. Johnstown Island. I don't know if you'd heard of that.
Never. This is fascinating.
Then they had St. Elmo's fire, and then actually they stopped in Pearl Harbor and were put up in a barracks where they spent a couple of days to finally get uniforms and shoes because he was just left with what he had. When he left Pearl Harbor on a Coronado, the seaplane version of a four-motored B-24 bomber, it was a two-story seaplane with a mess hall on the upper level. It took 15 hours to fly to San Francisco from Hawaii. But I'd never heard of that plane. Had you ever heard? You learned something.
Yep, well, I've learned a lot here.
So then from there, we spent a year in Clearfield, Utah. And when we moved there, they had just put in a Navy supply depot. And
So he's still in the service.
He's still in the service. He's on he has a 3-year enlistment.
Okay.
So when we stayed, and he was allowed to take his family with because he was an officer, and only officers were allowed to take their families with. So we moved to Clearfield, Utah, and we were there for 1 year. And we lived they were building, because the Navy was getting so much, they had built this big supply depot, so they didn't have enough housing. They were building up subdivisions, one right after another. We lived in a brand new little house. They were just, so this was a Navy supply depot, and I always tell people, my dad was sent to the Navy in Clearfield, Utah, and the nearest water was the Great Salt Lake. But it was also a prisoner of war camp.
Yeah. And
they lived in Quonset huts, and you could see them outside. Sometimes when we would drive into the base, you could see them, and they seemed like they had a garden. My dad said when the war ended that some of them didn't even want to go back to Germany. He said that the prisoners were treated very well.
So it was a German prisoner of war camp.
German prisoners of war, yes. And they lived in the little Quonset huts. I do remember those. And I do remember, I said I had a lot of sailors that pulled my pigtails. By then I'm about 9. Well, I think maybe I was 8 or 9 when we left Utah. When we left Utah, he went to San Francisco
Let me ask you, while you're in Utah, you're still in the service, and August of 1945, Japan surrendered.
Repeating this bulletin, dated San Francisco, The Federal Communications Commission quotes Domai saying, Japan accepts allied terms.
We were there, and all of us kids had a parade. We had pots and pans and anything we could bang, and we marched down the street and just hooting and howling. And yes, we were there for that, for sure. We left in October of '45. And he was traveling with another chaplain friend of his. And I don't know to this day. So the other chaplain calls his wife after they, get oriented. And he's there visiting with him afterwards, and he said they couldn't even talk. He was so emotional. And I mean, to be 5 days before in the South Pacific and then be in San Francisco calling your wife. And he said it was so emotional they could hardly talk. So he decided he wasn't going to call my mother. And so he wrote her a letter. And I want to tell you, he never lived that down the rest of his days.
So because his friend, fellow clergyman,
Yeah.
couldn't handle emotionally the phone call, he chose not to call your mother.
Because he thought he wouldn't be able to say anything anyway.
Beautiful.
So in the meantime, now they're about 4 or 5 days there before they're even getting arrangements on how to even get home. It's not, and it's crowded. San Francisco, he said, it's so crowded that you couldn't hardly find a place to stay. So, but he writes her a letter, and I do have the letter. And no, but I tell you, he never lived that down.
So he comes home at some point, and kind of they have their first meeting. Do you remember that?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Oh, that I remember. He took the train into Wilmer. Now, I have to tell you a little bit. We were living in a town called Pennock, Minnesota, which is southern plains of Minnesota, farm country where the soil is as rich as the oil of the oil fields. I mean, the soil is black, and it's just... So this was a small little community, and the nearest town of any sort was called Wilmer, Minnesota, which right now is the place where the first Somalians ever entered in the United States and lived. If you want to read about, there's a wonderful article in the New York Times about Wilmer, Minnesota. And it also was a train station. It had a roundhouse for repairs. And the Great Northern Railroad with the Empire Builder went through Wilmer, and it also went through Pennock. And during the war, when it was going to come through and it was loaded with supplies, our little mayor in town would get a notice from the Northern Pacific that we had to have a blackout during that time and when the train was going through Pennock. And so the siren would ring, and we'd know that it was a blackout because the train was going to go through loaded with supplies for the Army. And it was from that little town that then we moved to Walnut Grove, Minnesota, and then from there to Miami, Florida. And so we had, and I remember Clearfield, Utah quite well, actually. I was in 3rd grade. But here again, it was becoming, a military town, and the school couldn't handle all the influx of kids. My brother, I think, only went half days to school, and it was a whole influx.
So the school you went to was a public school?
Yes.
That was in there?
It was not on
Not a
base.
base, not
No.
a base school, yeah. As he gets back and gets acclimated into the Lutheran chaplaincy again, do you remember him giving lots of sermons or reflecting on the war and one, his experience, or two, the
No, he never used it in a sermon, never. But I think you could almost see when he first came back and the first time when he was preaching. He was fine when we were in Utah, I think because it was still military, and we'd have services on base, and he was really good friends with the Catholic chaplain, and we kids went to service there, like guys. But when he got back to Walnut Grove that first year, I think now I remember that he could hardly preach a sermon. I think he had a lot of trouble. He'd clear his voice, and my mother she'd always nag him and say, well, I was wrong, blah, blah, blah. But at any rate, I think of it now, I think that the first time he got up there and looked around and saw the farmers and the healthy and everybody's well, and he has left the South Pacific where he's seen all these other, he had trouble that first year, that first year or two, I think. He never said, I wish I had known, but no, I think that it bothered him some. But he did stay in the active reserve, by the way. And in fact, for some time, he was chaplain here up at Hazeltine, up at the military.
Oh, really?
Yeah. He was discharged in 60, he retired in 67 then as a commander. And that was when he had been a lieutenant commander, and that was still when they upgraded you one grade when you retired.
Right.
So he did retire as a commander.
Did he stay in the area, I mean, until his death? Did he live here?
Yes,
Okay,
yeah. And they had an apartment at the Lutheran home.
okay, and when did he pass away?
Passed away in 85. He
Okay.
was 77, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There was when you talk about Lutheran and Catholic priests, in the Nuremberg story, there was a Lutheran priest who was assigned to the Nuremberg trial.
Oh.
His name was Henry Gericke, Pastor Henry Gericke, Lutheran minister, whose job was to administer to the German prisoners of war, the Goerings, the Hesses, the Ribbentrops, with the idea of being there available. And the terms that you used as the motto, they will not march alone, or not be alone, and sort of the Geneva Convention on the difficulty that he had in his role. And his role was to, he felt, was to proselytize the German defendants, to not only be available to them so they would not march alone, be available,
Right.
but most importantly, to kind of get to know them and to convert them. Now, it's that process which the Lutheran and the Catholic priest were kind of ostracized among the officers, saying, how could you? These are people who perpetrated 6 to 9 million deaths, and you're going to try to convert them so that they can become Christians and save their souls? Question mark. And it's situation ethics that he, as a Lutheran, Gericke felt very strongly about, and he counted a few of those as converted. And that story, to me, is riveting from an evangelical viewpoint.
I know where you're going. I
And
understand.
I just am curious, and it may not have any impact of your story and your dad's story, but as whether he ever reflected on the enemy as being human beings, if you will, and subject to salvation, even though you're enemies.
Well, yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that, because the thing of it is, in reading this many letters, I couldn't incorporate all of this to bring to you, but there is a letter where he has, trying to remember the circumstances, where he actually feels, they had Japanese prisoners of war. He said, and when they took them, and I'm not even sure what island, I haven't got, I'd have to review the other letters to be accurate on what I'm saying. But he said he felt sorry for them. He said they were starving, they were everything, and they gave them a meal, and he said one of them ate the meal so fast he got sick. I mean, he was so grateful to have food. So he says it a couple times, I always feel a little sorry for the Japanese, he'll say to me. He'll write in some of his things. So here again, you have this, so that kind of indicates that he, had empathy for everybody.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, that was sort of interesting. I hadn't read that in a long time. And there's a couple other things that I was going to bring up that I would make some notes on. He always liked to have some music for his service, but mostly sometimes the band might play a little bit, or they would sing or something. But for a while he had an organ, and somebody had found an organ in some place or another, and the chaplains and the Catholic chaplain and all of them, everybody wanted the organ, so they decided to have a card game. So the one with the highest card got the organ, and my dad had the highest card, but it was a 4. And so it had been a 3 and a 2. And my dad proudly walked away with the organ. So, so when he was first in the military, he says that the only way that, if you were going to be assigned to a unit, it meant that the unit had more than 1,000 men, because it had to be over 1,000 men in the unit to justify a chaplain. And so that I found was sort of, and, oh, and when they were going overseas the first time, he said that they were, just as they were sailing, they were allowed to record a message to send home, and all of this was paid for by the Pepsi-Cola company.
Ah,
Yeah, and it was the Red Cross that sent the Christmas presents of the fruitcakes. And then there was the time that, then they had a butter mixture. This was when they were on in the tropics, a butter mixture called Carter's Spread Mixture. And it was designed to keep from melting, and it replaced butter, but he said it really wasn't very good. And I'm assuming it was some sort of margarine that was made especially so it wouldn't melt, because you just couldn't keep it in the tropics. And
you mentioned off camera something you call regarding Nescafe.
yeah, right. He said when he got the powdered coffee, you add water. He said it's called Nescafe, and my dad loved his coffee, and so he thought that was very exciting. And then I said, in the letters, there's approximately, he had sorted them for us ahead of time, so they all are in files according to month. But so I did a quick count, because he had put on about 530 letters, and then 50 letters from children that I wrote my dad quite often, and little cards and little notes, and my other brother would scribble things. So all of that's in there. I mean, we
Wow, what an archive.
we have a trove of history, to tell you the truth. Oh, and he said that they had water to take a shower or to wash with, and it was delivered in two-wheeled big trailers, and all of the water was purified with chlorine that they could use from, and this would be when they're on the islands. And but I still can't get over the military and how they, I mean, there's places where I think Coca-Cola and Pepsi would deliver many things, and they would not charge them at all. I mean, so it was interesting, and I'd think about, and the first thing when they'd land on an island, the very first thing they'd set up was a bakery, and they always made their own bread.
Did your dad mention at all about the black market? Did he, whether
No.
the idea of guys got stuff that could have been cigarettes, it could have been, other related matters they may or may not have used, but they used it for barter.
Yeah, no, he didn't say that. Then as far as the island people go, he said, I think this was when they were on Guadalcanal, yes. The islands, the natives would come to his services, because many of them were Episcopalians, and because from the missionaries being there, and some of them could even read, and he would give them little New Testaments. So the natives were very friendly. They loved the Americans, and the Americans enjoyed them. And he said, but some of them, as a result of the missionaries were gone, but they were Episcopalian natives.
Well, it brings a good question. We read so much about the Gideons and the Gideon Bible,
Right.
and making sure that they're available a lot of places. What about just having Bible availability in the service?
He indicates he had some New Testaments, and actually I don't have it recorded, but at one place he's getting in his letters, he writes how much the Lutheran Synod even provided him initially with wafers to take overseas and for communion and things. But some of this he might be in he said, if he put some of that in his footlocker, and his footlocker said chaplain, and so he said he had to stop putting chaplain on the footlocker, because the boys would figure out that there's some wine in there, and they would open the footlocker and go through.
Now that's good. That's good.
That's in one of his letters.
It's
like, so don't put chaplain on your footlocker with wine in it, because he said that it would be broken into.
Oh my golly, that is fascinating. Here you are today, and you reflect back on your dad's service during the military, and a very proud daughter. But do you have a sense of the history of it all? Do you have, now that you've read some of the letters and from your perspective?
Oh, yes, you know, I love reading the letters, and after opening this up, after I decided that I would talk to Phil, I got back into it. I can go an entire day and just be gone, I mean, and just be right into the history, yes. And I try to imagine the immensity of trying to feed these people, and the fluids, and the housing, and when they were given half a tent, so you had to, at one place he writes, so he's given a half a tent that you had to share with with somebody else, and there's one place, I can't remember where it is, in some of my notes, where he says they were given boots and things, I forget what island it was, but he said it was all very fine equipment. He said it was not cheap equipment. He felt that they were very well taken care of with equipment that they needed, and that it was not junk. He said it was very fine equipment. In the letter that he wrote before going overseas, the one that he left to my mother, and that was kind of, everybody was writing a letter, and then he tells about how he wants us to be educated, and then he does talk about dying, yes. Yeah, he does, for sure.
I know they encourage people to do their last will and testament anytime it's
right.
in the service.
It's quite an impressive letter.
Yeah.
I don't have it with me, but it's a very impressive letter, yes.
Also, as part of the chaplain's work, sometimes when somebody dies that's in your flock, if you will, you have to write a letter back home.
I have copies of the letters that he wrote, right here.
What do you get? Was it a standard letter, or did you get a sense
His
there was
letter,
sort of,
I have two copies. One of them is if he knew the gentleman, and he would write a little bit more. If he didn't know them, it was a standard letter, I'm pretty sure. Although he'll write.
well, read it. I would be
Okay.
interested to know what a difficult thing it's got to be when one of your fellow battalion members dies in the line of duty, and then part of your obligation is to write home to mom and dad. And so I'd be curious if you just take an example. It could be your.
Right, I'll read the letter. Yeah, we have copies of this. Okay, please let me express my deepest sympathy for you in the loss that you have sustained in the death of your son. I give the name. And Private was killed in action, fighting for the country that he loved and for ideals that he held dear. He has made the supreme sacrifice. It is to such as your son that we owe the freedom and safety and the security of our land. May it ever be a source of comfort to you that your son died fighting bravely for his country. It is not empty words to say that we miss James very much and have all been saddened by his death. He was well liked by his comrades. If I can be of further assistance to you, please do not hesitate to write to me. May the blessed God and Father of us all be your comfort and stay. He is with those who walk through the valley of the shadow of death, and has promised that they shall dwell in the house of the Lord. With kindest regards, Bertil, Erling, Chaplain.
Did he write at all about when there would be a death from, again, action, the consequences or the morale that it would have on the survivors? There's often a group that's there, somebody within the group dies, and the difficulty that you got to counsel those who've survived.
Yeah, right. Now, speaking of some of the spiritual things that he wrote about, he found the most solemn occasion that when he was in the service were those when I conducted communion services aboard ship before a landing. Then he writes, it is such a time that I tried to direct the thoughts of the men in prayer, in confession, so that they might have peace in their hearts. And we also prayed for divine protection during combat. Then he writes, he said, many of them told me later about their foxhole prayers. They were not hypocrites. They freely admitted that they had prayed harder than they had ever prayed before, or probably would ever pray again. I found that as all phases of life are intensified under combat conditions, sight, hearing, muscular reactions, mental processes. So is their spiritual life, as also to a similar degree intensified. Just as no man can continue for long the furious pace he attains physically under combat, so neither is it normal for a man to continue to be foxhole religious after he has returned to safer areas. That's pretty powerful stuff.
That is very powerful. And what a stress, or I shouldn't say stress, stress, knowing that they're going to land, knowing you've got to say the right words, and asking God's guidance to give you the words for that, because you may be the last person to talk to them before they land, and
Right,
now the odds rise dramatically that something bad could happen.
right. And then he goes in, I mean, it's just like the movies, those amphibian landings. I mean, he was all part of that. He was, So another thing, if you want to know about how these are some of the notes that he's written afterwards. He said, the only real problem I had overseas was the morale of the men who had trouble back home. In some instances, I made contact with the Division Red Cross officer, who then wrote to the nearest chapter to gain assistance for the family. In most instances, the nature of the difficulty was such that nothing could be done until the Marine got home himself. In such cases, I would listen to the man's story until he told everything, and then try to help him carry on despite the worries and anxieties he had about his family. Only in one case did I initiate a request for a man to be returned. And then he also writes that I considered visiting personnel in the hospital one of my most important overseas duties. These visits afforded me many eminently satisfying experiences, of which I described below. Right. So, that's also, during the war, then I'm sure nobody was sent home for anything. You could have, your father could die, your parents could die. There was no leave. There was really no leave. Yeah. And that's why, he'd have to, so he writes about that.
And that is part of the issue, where the soldier may have had a complete nervous breakdown, may have some trauma for what happened, and there is no immediate relief.
Right, exactly. So he has mentioned more than once in his letters, many times in his letters, the counseling of those that had.
Did he talk about conversion?
No. That would never have been my dad anyway. He would never try to, no. Mm-hmm. I don't think so.
Back to the Garricky issue, the fellow Lutheran chaplain who was at Nuremberg was proselytizing.
Right,
yeah.
Right. Of course, German was heavily Lutheran anyway,
Yeah,
so.
yeah. But they was, while he's.
Right, I understand what you're saying, right.
So now you're listening, you're there, you're the comforting, you're.
I try to imagine him, I would think that it would be more of a sympathetic ear than, more, no, I don't really see that role for him, no.
I don't want to digress on this, so we're going to talk off camera. As you came here today and not knowing what was going to happen.
No, I didn't.
And you've done a fantastic job explaining your dad. What's a question you would have wanted me to ask you about your mom, your dad, and sort of that World War II experience? We didn't really talk much about your mother, what she was going through back home. Was she angry at your dad? Were there emotions saying, you left me, you left me with 3 kids, and I had to birth one myself. You weren't even around. I'm making up emotions here, but I can just imagine whether she articulated that at all.
Oh, my, yes.
Oh, yeah.
Her letters are, first off, Pennock was a small community, Swedish and farmers, small farmers. If you had a section of land, that was a big farm. And these were sincere people, hardworking people, and came to church, the men with their brow was white and their face was red and tanned because these were workers. Now, My mother, in her first letter, Dad left in early part of January, and 5 days later, my mother writes, "Today is the coldest day we have experienced since we came to Minnesota. It was 35 below when we got up at 9 o'clock, and never went above 20 below zero all day. So, of course, we had neither Sunday school or church." 35 below, and she's got a coal furnace that has to be shoveled. And, oh no, there's many times in her letters she says, "Why didn't you talk to me more about this? Why did you really want to go?" And then again, she'll back off and she'll say, then it's, so she's 4 months pregnant when he leaves, and my brother is born in May. He leaves in January, and he's born in May. And it was 10 days before I even knew that he had been born from the American Red Cross. He got a notice. And you have to realize this little village, I walked, if a letter came in, the mailman would rush it right up to my mother. I mean, the whole town knew. And the operator the phone operator was sat right downtown, and mother would call her up and say, "Where's Ruth?" And she'd say, "Oh, she's over there playing with Alan," or something. I mean, it was, so the village took care of us. The church, my dad just took a leave of absence from this Lutheran church, and the church let him do it, and they let us live in the parsonage free for the times that he was gone in the military. Of course, we maintained it.
Right.
And then mother had a lady that did come and sleep there with her at night, and she would get up, and they paid her $6 a month, and she would get up every morning and stoke the fire for mother before my mother would get up, and then she wouldn't spend the day there. Her job was to be there at night in case she needed something, and then to stoke the fire, and then the coal furnace. But otherwise, mother would have to do it. But the ladies of the church, the people, the church were just wonderful. I mean, back in those days, people house cleaned, and they'd all come, 6 and 7 ladies, so the whole village took care of us during that time, believe me. If her car, well, she did drive, but gas was rationed, and I have ration coupons. I don't know, I'm sure everybody has some of those. My brother Carl and I were very close. I mean, she writes about us going outside and playing in the school, what I'm learning in school. And, Ruth needed glasses that cost $12.50. She was very frugal with money, and so was my dad. In fact, I don't know if I can find the place where I don't know, I've got it in here somewhere. He's eating he's must be like a chaplain school or something, and he's eating in this club, or this naval club or officers club. He's getting a dinner, and it's going to cost 20 cents. And he writes many times through this, and I was mentioning this to Phil, you'll get the menu. I get the menu of many places where what he ate, and about fried Spam and dehydrated potatoes, and cans of peas, and cans of fruit. But so there's a lot of humor for me in looking at his meals, because you have to remember, people back in those days didn't eat out a lot or anything, and so if you went out and ate and paid for a dinner, I mean, that was a big deal. So when he's taking the train to Norfolk, and he's first things on the freight train, and I don't have that one with me, but he's got another meal, and he's saying, like, for $1.75, I got turkey and salad and soup and crackers, and it's so there's much, he does talk about the food. Of course, sometimes then he can't write about much of anything anyway, because he can't tell where he is. It's all censored. We all have the envelopes.
Have you seen the letters where there is some censorship?
Yeah, I have some envelopes. I saved some envelopes with the censored signet on it. Yes.
That's cool.
Yeah.
Well, I hope you condense all this into a booklet for your family members.
Well, that's always been my plan, but it's first off, I'm going to have to finish reading the letters and make some more notes. I try to just write highlights, and so that it works kind of as an index if you want to read further about this thing, then you could refer to the letter of January 6, 1943 or something like that. But it's a huge project. And my one brother suggested scanning them to the cloud, but just to get them scanned, it'd be, I don't know what to do. I don't know what to do.
Well, it's easier said than done, it can be done, but that's a project. And you
Yeah,
almost-
exactly.
You always need to hire somebody to actually do it,
That's
physically
exactly
scan it
right.
and do it. Yeah, we deal with that constantly here, is how to catalog what you have. and
Exactly.
It's a stat. So you stayed in Minnesota really until your dad came back, and then you went to Utah?
We went to, yes, for a year, right, and then to Walnut Grove.
Okay, so when you left, you got the orders, if you will, or your mom said, hey, we're gonna leave the parish, you leave the manse where you've been living for the last many years, and the small village. How did the village react that all of a sudden, they've raised you?
Right, and I don't really know the answer to that. And yeah, I know, and not only that, my mother and 3 kids drove to Utah. My dad had to go out there and he find us a place to live and everything.
Yeah, yeah.
And then my mother had somebody, a young kid, drive us out there. Oh, I don't know how my parents did. And that, when he was going to be discharged, we had to go to California. So my dad packed us all in a car, and we left in October, around the 25th of October. And then we were going to Walnut Grove. Well, we went a circuitous route, I can tell you, because we didn't get to Minnesota till December 1st. We hit the road for 6 or 7 weeks. We went to the Grand Canyon, the Zion Canyon. We went everywhere. We waded in the Pacific Ocean, and we took Route 66 to Oklahoma and then up north to Minnesota. I mean, my dad was an adventurer. And we stayed in little motels, housekeeping motels. And then he had a flat tire when we were in Flagstaff, so we had to stay for 2 nights to wait to get a tire because it was, after the war. And so that's how he took us took us out of school for 6 weeks, and we traveled.
So you went to Walnut Grove, and that's California?
Minnesota.
Minnesota.
Walnut Grove, Minnesota.
Oy. Well, you've got some real travel on you then.
Yeah, I always say I'm sort of a gypsy. I was born in Winnipeg, and how I ended up in Jamestown is a long story. We have this book called Since You Went Away,
Right?
and this was by Judy Litoff and David Smith. And what they did was they decided to write letters from the home front rather than the ones that the military wrote home from the home front. And so in this book is published 2 of my letters. And they read, Ruth Erling from Pennock, Minnesota, was 6 years old when she began writing to her father, Bertil Erling, a Protestant chaplain with the Marines in the South Pacific. I write, this is done in 1943, they don't have a date. Dear Daddy Erling, are you lonesome? Do you live in a house? Sunday we eat very good. Ruth Erling, I signed my. Then the next letter is, Dear Daddy, this is, here again, this is in 1944 now, I'm a little older. I got a loose tooth. We have only 10 pages left in our reading books. Helen tried to pull my tooth. We read about Pinocchio. We are all lonesome for you. I like the letter we got today. Love, Ruth. Then on another page, she actually printed my letter. Those were typed notices, and then she decided to print my letter as it is written in the 6-year-old handwriting. And Greg, you have to see this?
Oh my golly.
So that's my letter to my dad, written in my handwriting, but I'm 6.
Oh, that's precious.
And that is published in this book. And I was thinking, since I live locally, that maybe I would donate one of these books to the library here.
Absolutely, that'd be thrilled, only if you sign it.
Right.
Yeah,
Right.
we want your autograph.
It's still available as near as I know.
Oh.
It's still.
So I am looking at a couple of items that were in your folder, you held back on me. And one is a Chaplain Bertil Erling, Lieutenant, United States Naval Reserve. He wrote, a chaplain writes from Guam, and I'd love you to read this. This is a great letter.
Yes, yes. The title of the article is Mid-Flame of Battle by Chaplain Bertil Erling. I'm writing this greeting to the readers of the Lutheran Companion from the island of Guam. I landed here on the day of the assault. I am not going into the story of military events. I ascribe to the grace of a kind and loving Heavenly Father that I survived the experience of the first few days. I was not sorry to be along because I spent most of my time with the boys who had been wounded, besides taking time to assist in the proper burial of the dead. Our progress was slow because every now and then we were pinned down by enemy mortar fire and had to throw ourselves into foxholes or flat on the ground. I thought my time had come when one enemy shell landed close and threw sand on my back. That was the closest call I had. Courage, devotion, and efficiency. After a few days, things became better and we could move around more freely. To see the way food and medical supplies were moved ashore, to see the way the wounded were cared for by courageous doctors, corpsmen, and litter bearers, to see the way every comfort was provided the men that conditions would permit was a credit to American efficiency and approach the miraculous. Under combat conditions, a chaplain's work is personal, speaking to individual men, giving comfort and cheer, inspiring faith and hope. The next is The Last Communion, is his title. The most impressive memory I carry with me is of the communion service we had on board ship the Sunday before we went into combat. The men were solemn and sincere and came forward for communion in long rows. It was plainly evident that they were seeking peace with God as a spiritual preparedness for the experiences they were facing. With some of the names on my communion roster turned up on the lists of the killed, there arises from my heart an earnest prayer that my sermon may have been adequate, that the service may have brought those men into a saving relationship with God. Under settled camp conditions, I have usually had 3 services on every Sunday morning, with communion on the first Sunday of the month. I have made it a practice to use mess halls for my church services. Members of the division band have provided me with music for the hymn singing. Under such circumstances, I have enjoyed a large church attendance on the part of the men. As soon as conditions become more settled here on Guam, I hope for such an attendance again. I pray God's blessings on the work of our chaplains, that men may be won to a saving faith during their time in the service, and that they may also be won to active participation in the work of the church upon their return to civilian life. Well, that answers part of your question.
It does. And on the very last page of that is a copy of a service.
Yes, that he held for Franklin Roosevelt.
Correct. Could you talk about that, or just the show? Tell us.
And you saw that. You saw that.
Yeah, you were holding back.
Oh, there
I'm
it
getting
is.
an article here for you, Phil. Yeah.
Okay, this is dated April 12, 1945. It's a memorial service for President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and it's being held in the U.S. Naval Barracks in Clearfield, Utah. And my dad is giving he's the minister, memorial sermon, The Cross and the Crown, Chaplain Bertil A. Erling. And then the end hymn, of course, is the Navy hymn, The Eternal Father, Strong to Save, which we kids all knew. I used to know all of them, the Army song, we knew all of them. But this is one of the most beautiful hymns I think ever written. I just enjoy every time I hear it. I like it a lot. It's very meaningful.
Do you get a sense that he wrote a sermon for this occasion?
Oh, yes, of course, yes.
So,
But I don't have the sermon.
Very interesting. And this was given in Clearfield?
April of 1945.
Okay,
I did look up, he died in April, I think April 12th, 45.
yeah. So when did you guys get to Clearfield? This must have been a relatively...
We got to get Clearfield in the fall of 44 and left in the fall of 45. We were there exactly a year.
Okay.
Exactly a year.
Now there is a research project, just saying, I bet someplace is that sermon. All right, just saying. And does Clearfield still have a base there?
They do, there's a Hill Air Force Base, I believe, or I think there's an Air Force base of some sort. It's still, the Navy depot, as near as I understand it, is not there. But there is still some military influence in Clearfield. We did go into Salt Lake City and Ogden. Ogden, Utah was a town we went to one time shopping. That would be a bigger, but we had picnics up in the mountains and and it only rained once that whole year that we lived there. In Utah, it only rained once, and so in the evening after dinner, your job was to water the lawn. And back in those days, there weren't sprinklers or automatic sprinklers. You had the regular hose. And of course, we would fight because it was most fun was to water the lawn, of course, with a hose, because put a hose in the hands of a kid, and it's like, that was a lot of fun. You didn't want to do the dishes, you wanted to be the one to sprinkle the lawn.
All right, well, I'm going to take on the assignment of a quest. Let's just see if, dumb luck, we may find that sermon someplace, somewhere.
The cross and the crown.
Yeah, I've got the picture of the page, so let me play with that, because that's going to be the basis of a Phil Zimmer article. I'm just saying how this is going to work.
See, Phil, you're not going to get by out of this for nothing.
No. This is peer pressure.